chief, you're always a chief. So I still refer to him as Chief Estelle Joe because he may not like me aging him a little bit, but I've been knowing him a long, long time since I was quite young and many years ago. And I want to also thank Mi'kmaq people for welcoming us into their ancestral territories, and I really appreciate the land acknowledgement of the Innu and Inuit and the Beothuk. And I had the honor of working with the Innu and Inuit in the early 90s, and I actually taught in Nain for the Labrador College, I think, for about 3 weeks. And it was just the experience of my life, and I'll never forget it, how welcomed I was into that community. And I just still remember the smoked salmon. And that was back in the day when you could still kind of travel with caribou, and the students had given me caribou meat, the Inuit students, going off script because I'm a storyteller, but I hope I don't go on script and tell falsehoods like what's happening into the US elections right now. and so maybe just kind of remind me, maybe to give us a few minutes to take any questions. So thank you so much. And I will say, when I was introduced to the edges, and I'm not very familiar with the discipline of geography, but maybe I am indirectly, but what's this edges? What is this boundaries? And this is something that has been challenging us all of our lives, and particularly for Indigenous people. And but then when I read on, they said, oh no, at the edges, this is where we interact and so forth. So you'll see that theme throughout. And my good friend from St. Mary's University, a project that I'll just briefly tell you about that we're both working on, Dr. Tony Charles, he said, he said that could be a good thing, working from the edge, on the edge, cutting edge, and so forth. But I had to wrap my head around that theme, and so we'll see how it goes. So I want to just explain a little bit from where I'm from. As you heard, iron water cuts high through the rocks. And I know our linguist, which you'll hear a little bit more from, Bernie Francis, said we have to start using our Indigenous place names, our Mi'kmaq place names. And so that's where originally I'm from. And we'll go through this a little bit. You'll see like that middle map. These are our, for Mi'kmaq, and I'm going to be speaking from the Mi'kmaq perspective, and particularly my perspective. We had these 7 traditional hunting and fishing districts, and I'm from Guswood, where the land ends, but I heard from an elder that it's the end of the water flow. And that's basically all southwest Nova Scotia, but of course now if you look at that other upper map, it's just a tiny little reserve. And I'd like to honor my grandmother, Leona Pictou, Jeremy, and who was a great influence in my life. And she was a chief in the mid-70s, which was such a courageous thing to do at the time for a woman. And I am aware of my rights and of treaties and everything because of her and the stories that she told. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of relational mobility, and by an Anishinaabe scholar with the University of Victoria in Indigenous law and a good life. And he talks about this concept of relational mobility and the freedom as being essential to the freedom of seeking a good life, and then some of the colonial impacts that describe how we came from those traditional hunting and fishing districts to the little tiny boundaries called the reservation, and to look at what does relational mobility offer to transforming the boundaries and indigenizing those edges, and then look at some concrete examples and lessons learned. So again, just to give you an idea, these are I robbed the 7 districts. I robbed that big map from the Native American Indigenous Games last summer when they were held in Halifax. I just thought it was such an excellent map. And and I don't speak Mi'kmaq fluent, so forgive me, I'm still learning and so forth. But as you can see, these bigger areas, and now those little dots that are, oh yes, dots right here are the reserves. These are both basically the Mi'kmaq, and this is the Willistic, or formerly known as Maliseet peoples. And I always like showing this map because this was a traditional use study back in 2007, I believe. And you can see all those, they're little stars, but all those little dots is like our land and water use. And I always ask, why is it so concentrated? Why that big dark dot right there? Anyone want to venture a guess? What's that? Berries? That's the reserve. Yeah, so that's the reserve right there, that little, that's, and so anyways, but you can see going up and down the river and still trying to move within that hunting and fishing district. And yeah, this is just to explain that a little bit more. As you can see the dots, there's my reserve, but you look at this is from Bernie Francis and Trudy Sable's book that I referenced later on The Language of Mi'kmaq. But look at the borders of those districts. To think about that. And Roger Lewis, an archaeologist, and he works at the Nova Scotia Museum, in his research, he found that these boundaries are not just straightforward, that they followed natural ecologies, which is very interesting of how the Mi'kmaq had governed themselves and so forth. And so, just to point that out to the geographers, it's just sort of like straight lines. And we run into so many issues with property rights and so forth with these straight lines where rivers have to be maneuvered and so forth. And I'll correct that a little bit. So relational mobility. This is going to give me a problem. I thought this was such a good idea, but I borrow from John Burrow's work, and it's really interesting when, as Mi'kmaq or as Indigenous people, when we're trying to articulate something, particularly once it's erased, and I was trying to articulate hunting and fishing rights, which I'll come back to and so forth, and you know, how we moved around and the cycles and so forth, and all of a sudden I ran across this concept of relational mobility, and I said, yes, that's what that is, and that's Dr. John Burroughs, and he talks about this quite extensively in his earlier work, 2016, which I'll reference from an intellectual and physical point of view, and we'll come back to this throughout. And you know, and he talks about relational mobility practices contain great lessons in pursuing freedom and a good life. And he's talking about, you know, being able to move not only within your ancestral hunting district, but conceptually also, how do I explain this? Being able to move amongst other worlds, because it almost seems like Indigenous people were either, we have to be authentic and stuck in the past and have no relevance to the present or the future. And he talks about that, and particularly from an urban point of view, how even though you might be in the city, but you still have this connection with home. But he also talks about the laws and how they are still laws devised to limit our movements and to foster confinement within ever diminishing spaces. And there is an enclosure of spaces. And no matter which way you look at it, we'll talk a little bit about property rights. But one of the laws that he talks about, of course, is the Indian Act. How many are familiar with the Indian Act? You should be. There's a long, long history of geographers and surveyors and so forth connected with this Indian Act. And what he's talking about, that we were, like, the Indian Act came into existence in 1876, but it actually was a compilation of colonial laws before that. So it really runs much deeper, I know, in Nova Scotia, or in what's called now Canada, back into the 1840s actually. So we weren't considered people, we were considered wards of the state. And this is where we made the transition, and throughout time they formalized these little pieces of land that was supposed to be lands reserved for Indians. However, it was still always under the Minister of Indian Affairs. We had no social or political rights. In fact, we weren't even allowed to organize, and at one point it was against the law to even hire a lawyer. And of course, we all know about the residential schools. And I do want to just spend a moment, because I do some work on gender of women. It almost, they try to erase Indigenous women. And what I mean by that is, was a very paternalistic, patriarchal piece of legislation that we're still battling with today. When we talk about colonialism and so forth, we tend to forget what came with colonialism is patriarchy. And that's been internalized in some of our communities. So under this Indian Act, we weren't even allowed to run for chief and council. We weren't even allowed to vote in our own chief and council elections until about 1951. And that's why I say, with the women, I know some women that ran and became chiefs in the 60s, 70s, they were very courageous to do that. And the most devastating, and I won't get into this because it's so complicated, but when you married a non-Indigenous person, you lost your status. You had to leave the community. And even if I was to marry a Indian man from another reserve, I had to still leave my community and move to his reserve. And I know this for a fact because when I was chief, way back when, we had an elder who was part of our community, and she was forced to move, and she wanted to come home. And we made that happen, and basically she wanted to come home to die. I get emotional when I think about that. So the impact on women and our children, and it's still today, even though in 2019 they said they removed gender discrimination from the Indian Act, and you're still feeling the impacts of that today. It's very complicated, but it's caused so many inequities in our communities and forcing us to deal with certain segments of our society as different class citizens. And so we continued to lose our status up until 1985 with Bill C-31. And in between that, we all received the right to vote in the federal elections. Remember, we couldn't vote up until that point. And throughout that time, women also had a lot, and it's still going on to some degree, non-consensual sterilizations. And this is what I mean by trying to erase women, to erase Indians. And I'll come back and talk a bit about treaty rights. I kind of stole this from another slide, and I'm trying to explain why Indigenous feminism is so important. So what some of you may not know, when you try to trace back Indian Affairs reports, because each reserve had a what they called an Indian agent, and it wasn't an Indigenous person. It was somebody hired to overlook the community, oversee the funds, or if there was any, and they report it back to the federal office. And then all of a sudden, like if you look, you see Department of Indian Affairs, and then it disappears. And I remember this. I remember this back in the mid-90s doing this research. What happened? And they disappear because they become a Department of Mines and Energy. So think about that. Department of Indian Affairs becomes a department within the Department of Mines and Resources. I'm sorry, not energy, and to really think about that. And it's very difficult for me to explain because of how I felt about that, because I have such a, because of my grandmother and the teachings of people like Joe, Joe and others, is that we have such an intricate relationship with all of life. But in this case, where we disappear, it's a commodity, and that we're just still not human beings. To kind of give you an example of the history there, and this gives you the history in terms of, like, we can talk Department of Indian Affairs, Department of Aboriginal Affairs, Department of Indigenous Affairs, and now they have 2 departments. And so it just gives you an idea. We started out with the British Indian Department up until 1860. Secretary of State, et cetera, the Interior, Indian Affairs, and then we go under mining resources. So one of the things I just want to explain, like, the impact of that Indian Act had what I call geographical discrimination. Has really, like, we get into this thing of on reserve, off reserve, and so forth, and it's really impacted our traditional governance systems and so forth. And I thought this quote by Nicole Pennock is so profound. And think about this when we do our land acknowledgements. What do you think about when we do that? It's so important today to say that we're on, and the traditional territories. But from her point of view is that it erases Native people, Indigenous people, Indians, whatever you want to call them, from the cities. It's though we're not present in those cities, and we know like 60% of the population on average of Indigenous people reside in cities. And it's a very telling thing about in this era of reconciliation. These reconciliation era acknowledgements, some kind of an effort to capture the indigeneity of this space in a pronouncement, bound by the strict confines, and get back to this relational mobility a little bit. I was very interested, and a lot of my work I wanted to think about, and this was inspired by elders because they would have had their language and so forth, these treaties. And as you probably well know, that we had this treaty known as the Donald Marshall Jr. Case with dealing with fisheries, and it was founded on the 1760-61 treaties, which I'll talk to a bit. And of course, and Joe and I know only too well what some of that bureaucratic talk was and the negotiations was, and I thought, oh, and when this elder had reminded me, he said we had our language then and so forth, and that sent me on a mission to find out what grassroots people actually thought about treaties. And some of this coincided in the spirit and intent of those treaties, and I'm not very good on, I don't really like actual wording, and I usually read between the lines, particularly when we're looking at history and so forth, but there are some concepts here, and this was the 1752 treaty. Just to explain for those of you who don't know, here on the East Coast, we have the peace and friendship treaties, and it was the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, and so forth. And there was a chain of them from about 1725 to about the 1760s or 1770s, and there's about a chain of them, and they were kind of renewals, and they were just that, peace and friendship treaties. That the 1760-61 treaties, and basically this is the Marshall decision. In 1999, the Supreme Court ruled that the peace and friendship treaties of 1760 and 61 created an ongoing treaty right to obtain necessaries through hunting and fishing by trading the products of traditional activities. And so it also stated that courts must choose from among the various possible interpretations the one which best reconciles Indigenous interests. And so one of the positive things, we're still struggling to implement fishing. And look, we've now ended up with 3 types of fisheries: the commercial fishery, the food fishery, and the treaty fishery. And I won't go into all of those, but one of the positive things came was to extend this concept of land to water. And I think it's just so fundamentally important. And I know from my perspective, when I talk about land, I'm thinking of water. Inland waters, oceans, I was brought up on the coast and so forth. But it's getting to the point that we have to constantly stating it and stating it. And for those of you, I'm not sure you're familiar with law at all, but we have this doctrine of discovery terra nullius, which means like they claim the land because they looked at it as empty, it's indigenous people not there. An Aboriginal from Australia came up with aqua nullius and fighting for water rights, and that's one of the beautiful things. And this is a petroglyph that's in Ketchimakujik National Park. There's all kinds of petroglyphs of our relationship with water. These are my people on Bear River, canoeing out to what we call a diggy gut. And I don't know if you'll recognize, but here is Chief himself, Joe, and they took a canoe. I'm not sure of the timing of that. Oh, in 1999 as well, and it's in a film called Spirit Wind, made and produced by Kathy Martin. And what they were duplicating there is a long history of going across from today Newfoundland to Unama'ki or Cape Breton, and that was an actual canoe route that was taken often. Or I have a great uncle that was my grandmother's uncle, Louis Jeremy, that made seafaring canoes and would canoe to Boston. Now, if any of you are familiar with the Bay of Fundy and the tides, that was quite a feat to be able to go across and time those tides and then make your way down to Boston. And I know the Passamaquoddy have interesting stories of how they would interact with the Mi'kmaq on that water. This is what I just think so fundamentally important, because with those treaty rights and the fishing, what we received was, now you have to realize, this is coming from commercial fishermen. Oh, you never fished. You didn't fish. And we have this rich history. In fact, you go back to some of those Indian Affairs reports, they used to document how much money we made from fishing. Or there was the stories and documentation of selling lobsters out of these birch bark canoes. And this is a tradition that's coming back, and of course we're faced with the difficulty with the birch bark and so forth, but we do have like Todd Labrador, we have women now taking up making these canoes. But I'm talking about mobility here. The issue that we run into in trying to interpret these rights and so forth is that we seem to be always squeezed, like it's obvious that we have a relational. We have a relationship with those lands and waters. We rotate it with the seasons. We rotate it with the seasons to collect food and so forth. And some of us would say that it's indigenous with all of creation, amongst people and all of creation. Here is the issue. We just seem to be, as John Burroughs would say, either stuck in the past, or if you want to move to the future, you have to assimilate into today's market system. And so, I always tell a funny story to my students. There used to be a man up here in one of these, and they said, why are you putting that man up there? So I had to come find something a little bit more circular. But this happens that in order to exercise those treaty rights, we had to assimilate into a fishery that was being highly privatized. What I mean by that, all the independent fishermen were becoming privatized, and it's now in the control of a few companies. Think of farming, same thing. On the other side of the spectrum is when it comes to conservation and so forth, it was just like we had to have this fortress concept of or no human footprint concept of conservation. And it just seems that we're stuck in between those two ends of the spectrum. And how do we move beyond that? And a lot of it has to do with property rights and this concept of property rights. And ironically, that Indian Affairs, when one of the biggest detriments to economic development was because we couldn't put up anything for collateral. And now they're scurrying and trying to, and they've done this somewhat, to afford Indigenous nations, turning some of that into private property so that it can put it up for collateral. So this is what we seem to be caught in between. And so, going back to John Burroughs, he says, rights should not be used to alienate us from our lands, even if we stay put. If you're on the reserve, you're not moving, or are forcibly removed or constantly moved within our territories. Our territorial relationships should not be conceptualized in the same manner as common law or property rights. And just to really think about that, so what I'm trying to get at here is the relationship with the land and water. What is your relationship to the land and water? Indigenous, and he comes up with two principles that as a way to move out of this. He says Indigenous people should be allowed to integrate non-Indigenous peoples into their communities under their laws. Now that's a very interesting concept, because I know the community I come from is very mixed race. And what happens with this, these different jurisdictions and geographical discrimination is that we have to treat the non-Indigenous people. We can't, let me put it this way. If you have a family issue and you want to treat the whole family, it's almost like, oh, well, you don't have status, so you have to go under the province. We can only help this, and so it's a fragmented approach. But he's talking about something even bigger than that, that we can integrate you and welcome you into our community if you follow our laws and so forth. And he said to harmonize with other political units. And he's saying we must be able to, and so this is on the intellectual part of relational mobility. Stop sticking Indigenous people in one frame, and to think about them in different frames, and that we are allowed to integrate with other political units and so forth. I remember, so here's what happens. Rather it's in academia, economics, and so forth. There's a wonderful concept, Etowoptima, two-eyed seeing, and that Albert Marshall and his wife, the late Regina Marshall, both doctors too as well, with honorary degrees, put together this concept for science. And first I couldn't get it. I thought, what the heck is talking about two-eyed seeing? I've been doing that all my life, but I spent some time with Elder Albert, and he's talking about taking the best of both worlds. But I would love to see even more circles in here, like in multiple perspectives, not just two perspectives. And if you talk about the Mi'kmaq or Indigenous worldview and the Western worldview, and it's supposed to be taking the best of both those worlds, and that's where the magic happens. This is where the magic can happen. What can we create new together? But often what happens is that the Western worldview will always, like we're made to conform to that view. We have to integrate. So be careful when you talk about, oh, we're going to integrate them, or we're going to include them. Are you going to do that for the sake of doing it, or are you looking for transformative change? And we have this concept of in the livelihood fisheries, of taking only what you need. And it's getting a little bit impossible, because now that we've been assimilated into, it's really difficult with different fisheries and different points of view even within our own nations. And I contend, now this was in the concept of concept of conservation, that in the era of reconciliation. It's interesting that United Nations and I and my colleague Tony Charles just met with them here in last month. The Indigenous unit, they're producing a report. This is in progress and it should be coming out. Indigenous people's mobility, associated livelihoods, and collective rights over lands, territories, and resources. And what they're talking about there now, there's some criticisms of this and there could be some debates, but by allowing people with their Indigenous people, with their Indigenous laws, and I'm talking Indigenous laws, not law as you know of it and separate from Aboriginal law, but their laws for living or applying those concepts like benevolence it actually contributes to biodiversity as opposed to taking away from it. And we think about this, and think about farming when we do this, we do this rotational farming and so forth. And there is some hope. I was just saying this earlier this morning with IPCA's Indigenous people, our Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'm leery of it, but there is some good work being done. And a lot of times it's because even if you look at the Big Bear project out west, they're constantly having to fight with logging industries. But what I'm trying to get at here, when you put the word Indigenous in front of something, does it really mean it's Indigenous led? Or that is the thing. Well, how much context? And you know, I'm the honorary district chief for the Confederacy of Mainland and Mi'kmaq, and they employ about 170 people, and they're not all Mi'kmaq. We have a lot of people in different departments there. And when they come in with maps or marine spatial plan, it drives me crazy. I'm saying, where's the Mi'kmaq names? Where's the Mi'kmaq names? What is really Mi'kmaq about this content? And I'll come back to that a bit. But there is some good work being done, and we're working on that. And then I have, I know in Ketchimakujuk National Park, which is very sacred and dear to my grandmother. I could have quoted from an article I write about that. Her ancestors are buried there, so are my ancestors buried there. There's quite a history how that became a park. Anyways, to make a long story short, I always say make a short story long, but make a long story short, is that they now have a management plan, a co-management plan, where Mi'kmaq concepts are being introduced into that plan. And will it become just a no human footprint area? We'll see. And then we have the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative, where these were forest lands, they're provincial crown lands, supposedly, but they were clear cut, and now trying to reintroduce sustainable forestry practices, and now getting to the point where can we do ceremonies in there, can we collect medicines in there, can we have cultural camps in there. And now I'm new at this. My favorite linguist, Bernie Francis, helped us with this. We have a research center, I want to say research lab. There's a difference of any of you in academia. Like, you call it a center, you're under all of this other bureaucracy. You call it a lab and get away with a little bit more. And so we wanted to bring this concept of environmental governance to it. And we searched and searched for a name. And Bernie Francis came up with this name. And I should have spelled this out. Willaguduk. Close. Wisconsin. And what he's talking about there is working together, and he wanted to make sure not over Mother Earth, with Mother Earth. We just opened that up on Indigenous Day, June 21st, and this is the coinciding website is still in development, being finalized. It's huge. It's a huge project, biodiversity conservation and the health and well-being of Indigenous people. Again, trying to connect the land and waters with the health and well-being of Indigenous people. And it's got one lead principal investigator, Brenda Parley with the University of Alberta, and 5 co-leads, of which I have the honor of being one. But as a part of that project, we're aiming for 140 Indigenous-led place-based projects around the world. But we come up with these 10 themes, which we always get into problems because they all interrelate and so forth. But with Dr. Tony Charles and I, what he's helping me co-lead is the recognition of Indigenous rights and sustainable use. And